Hotep, happy Juneteenth to you. June 18th. We're celebrating in a day early for Juneteenth, and we have a phenomenal guest today, Dr. Larry J. Walker, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Higher Education here at UCF. His research focuses on race, leadership, and policy. Additionally, Dr. Walker has several years of experience in education and politics, including serving as the legislative director for former Congressman Major R. Owens. And so with that, let's talk about Juneteenth. How you doing, Dr. Walker?
Dr. Butler, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that you were able to be here. And I thought about who would be a great person to have talking about Juneteenth. And knowing all the work that you do and all the things that you have on your plate, I am happy that you are able to join us today. And so just tell me a little bit about, how did you get started in advocacy work and working along those lines?
Yeah, thank you for your question and thank you for having me on your show. So I think it's something, it goes back, I don't know, maybe years. I grew up I'm from Philadelphia. And, particularly when it comes to work in the Black community, advocacy work in the Black community, Philadelphia has a long tradition of activism, to be quite frank. So you talk about, the roots of the AME Church and various other entities have been created to ensure the African Americans have the opportunity to be successful. So I would say first and foremost, just being from Philadelphia and to grow up in that city with a vibrant Black community. And activism, years ago, Philadelphia's had several Black mayors also. Like I said, it kind of, had an opportunity to grow up in that kind of environment. Right. And also I had to highlight the work growing in the Black church. So, I always saw my grandparents volunteer and give to underserved, marginalized populations. So those are the things that really inspired me early on.
Nice. And Philly, of course, is known as the city of brotherly love. And so there was love that was provided in terms of helping people to recognize who they were and find promise in themselves. And so you are a testament to that.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So let's start off, I guess, talking a little bit about Juneteenth. And how did you come to know about Juneteenth? And what does the significance of it mean to you?
So that's a very good question. I'm not sure, maybe an undergrad. I got to be, I spent most of my time in parochial school and, growing up in Philadelphia. And before that, I lived in New Jersey, but I didn't hear about Juneteenth until undergraduate. And I attended a historically Black college university undergrad, Chin University. And that's where I think initially I learned about Juneteenth, and like a lot of Americans for the last couple of years who, really finding out about Juneteenth, I was shocked. I've always loved history, and I can't remember, maybe in a history course I took, and a professor talked about Juneteenth, and obviously I knew about the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and I knew the war ended in 1865. But Juneteenth was never really highlighted in my curriculum. and there are a lot of people that, face similar situations. So I think initially it was an undergrad. And since then, it's always something, like I said, I love history. So I've even studied, what happened around that period of time, even more since then.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a similar story to you. If I heard about it, it wasn't in a way that it registered, right? And I was actually in my master's program and maybe possibly even in my PhD program. So I was an adult when I really paid attention to what Juneteenth was, because I used to see and hear about people, and I guess it really is about proximity and where you grow up. So I grew up in Connecticut and I heard about it. I used to hear about people going out to these galas, right? These jubilations but never really with context. It was just be that this day, people were getting together, they were all dialed up, right? They were all dressed up and they were going out on the town. And so I heard about that from year to year to year. I heard about, okay, this celebration, but I never really did any real searching to find out what it really was and what it was about. I just thought it was a party, people were just going out to party, Then I got invited. And the people who invited me were college students, and they were involved with it and stuff like that. And they made a decision that we're going to go. So we were all on campus, and we decided we were going to get tuxedos and all this other stuff to kind of go to this thing. And so we did it. We rented a limousine, and we went, right? My first time. And that's when I really started to pay attention and learn about the history of it all. And so, and it just goes to show you that if people don't teach you, you don't hear about these things, then you're going to be ignorant to it or not understanding what it's all about. You might not do the history lesson, you might not do that deep dive into figuring out what it is really all about. And so, did you attend or go to any galas, or what has been your experience hanging out with Juneteenth?
Yeah, so I haven't had attended any of the galas, but I've certainly attended a number of Juneteenth events, and obviously the event we're going to discuss is going to take place later on today. Being actively involved in organizing that, but I have been to several Juneteenth events, and like you said, and particularly it's occurring in the summer. Like I said, being from Philadelphia, I can often remember hearing on radio about today's Juneteenth, or Juneteenth is next week, and like I said, participating in various activities, whether I was undergraduate or as an adult, attending various festivities celebrating Juneteenth.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you're going to be hosting an event later on today, and so tell me a little bit about that and who your guests are going to be.
Yeah, so very excited. Title Celebrating Black Women's Brilliance, and to provide some context, as you and I well know, Black women have been doing the work, as we say, for generations, but frequently their work is not recognized and their brilliance is not recognized. Right. And UPCA United to promote cultural awareness is having associated with UCF downtown. We're hosting this event. That's going to occur later on today. It'll start at 11 and end at noon. And we have a panel, a brilliant trio, best way to describe it, starting with UCF's own Dr. Berry, who's Vice Provost and Dean. We also have, very fortunate to have the newly appointed Dean, FAMU's Florida A&M University's Law School, Dean Keller. And then we also have Dr. Barton Stubbs, who's been in a lot of her advocacy work in the Paramore area. And New Image is in charge, director of New Image Youth Center in Orlando. So like I said, a trio of brilliant Black women, and looking forward to an engaging discussion later on today about Juneteenth and some of the challenges and also all the success they've experienced.
Nice. So what was it like trying to create this event and being a part of building it up so that you can have this phenomenal event?
It's funny. Thank you for that question. It's funny because, UPCA, we've had various events over the last year or so, a toy drive, et cetera. And I said, I'm someone who does a lot of advocacy work. And so Juneteenth is always on my mind, especially when we get closer to the summer. And then, a few months ago, I had come up with an idea. It's kind of popped in my head one day, and emailed a few people affiliated with UPCA, and voila, it turned into now it's in a week-long event. And, had the idea about the title, came up with the title about, celebrating Black women's brilliance. Yeah. And we identified a few participants, and here we are.
Yeah, we are. Excellent. So your journey has been an exciting one. I remember talking with you some time ago about, coming into the academy and the work that you want to do and get yourself established. How did college become your reality, and what did you learn, and how did you kind of progress to be Dr. Larry Walker that you are today?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And, I think I always tell people in terms of my journey is an interesting one, right? So you mentioned, I have about 5.5 years experience working on Capitol Hill, but I've also worked in pre-K through 12 settings, right? So I have almost a decade of experience. I've worked for a foundation and had various other experiences, worked as a researcher. I've worked at other post-secondary institutions, taught at Loyola University of Maryland, and I've also taught at Howard University. So I have a variety of experiences. But more than anything, I think it goes back to your original point about my interest in advocacy. And you highlighted in my bio that race, leadership, and policy are the area, 3 areas of my focus of my research.
Right.
And from undergraduate to my doctoral work, those 3 areas have primarily been in my focus, particularly, like I said, when it focuses on issues relating to race and policy.
Okay.
And like I said, one thing I want to highlight for people, watching this program is that, you talk about how do you get to higher education. And it was one of those things that I'm a teacher at heart. And I always joke with my friends, it's because whether it's pre-K through 12 or higher education, et cetera, I'm an educator. That's what I do. And I feel like I was born to be an educator. So it's just a matter of just transitioning from policy work, doing education work, and pre-K through 12 education work to now to higher education work.
Nice, nice. And so you went straight through? Did you do your undergrad?
No, I didn't. I did bachelor's, master's, and I took some time working, like I said, working on the Hill and some other things, and then went back, 12 years ago or so to get my doctorate.
Okay, all right. And so the work that you're doing at UCF, you coming in as an assistant professor, you actually really kind of looked at a host of different things, but you kind of jumped in right the minute you got here. I started seeing you doing podcasts, other things, writing news, I guess commentary and things along those lines, but also you've been a guest on a couple of local stations to talk about the work that you're doing. How did you brand yourself? How did you do that? What happened that made you become the Dr. Walker that people are seeking out to do this work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's funny because I am getting that a lot more because, as you said, I came in as assistant professor. I've spent a lot of time in Central Florida and Orlando. I'm not from the area originally. Really, a lot of that is just come from just hard work. And I think going back, and it's going to be the theme of my advocacy work. I think with advocacy, there comes a certain a level of commitment. And when it comes to sharing with people your concerns and solutions to certain issues. So in terms of, you mentioned I've had a chance to write, I've written so far 4 op-eds for the Orlando Sentinel. And originally with that is I had written op-eds for other periodicals before, ebony.com, jet.com, and even the Baltimore Sun. So some of that experience, but understand, like I said, tying it into my advocacy work. And originally my first op-ed related to about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, when we had the incident national story of the young 6-year-old Black girl who was arrested, right? And that infuriated me. And once again, I do a lot of work about race, and I wrote an op-ed and had a chance to send it to the Orlando Sentinel, and they published it. But also in terms of some of the local TV work, it's just one of those things that I think initially at UCF wrote a profile about a journal article that I wrote with a colleague on race-based trauma. And I think that initially led to an interview, and then it just kind of snowballed. And particularly with my policy background during the election, and once again, I write a lot about race. So, I'm not in politics right now anymore, but I think that my Hill experience and I worked on a number of political campaigns gave me opened the door for me to talk about some of these policy issues. And then once again, we talk about the racial upheaval, right? So I would write a lot about race, about my own lived experience as a Black male. So that really opened some doors for me to talk about some of these issues.
Excellent, excellent. So we've been dealing with a whole lot of things as of late around critical race theory. And would you say that you are a student of that theory? And if you are a student of that theory, can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing it kind of being co-opted, this message about what critical race theory is right now?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for that question, because there is a lot of misinformation, which is consistently happening here in the United States, which troubles me as a citizen. So yes, do I use critical race theory? Absolutely. And I use critical race theory because, we celebrated last year 400 years of the first enslaved Americans born here in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. So you cannot, the United States' history in terms of the challenges that the country is encountered have been rooted in issues relating to race. Right. So let's tie it into some current events. You can't have a conversation about why so many members of the Black community, when it comes to COVID-19, were infected and had higher mortality rates without having a conversation about race, particularly housing segregation, or limited access to healthy foods, or limited access to healthcare, right? So in order to properly examine these issues, it has to be centered in race. These things don't happen out of nowhere. When it talks about, infant mortality rates, or pregnancy-related problems that Black women encounter in hospitals, You have to have a conversation of race. Education, you and I know, the school to prison pipeline, I've written about that. You have to have a conversation about race. And Dr. Butler, I want to also note that we have these conversations back and forth, often one side and saying one thing, another side saying anything about issues relating to race, is that we have decades of quantitative research to prove that race is intertwined in every aspect of the United States society. And it's a fact. And it's a fact that a lot of Americans don't want to accept, but the research is there. And you and I have our own lived experiences also to highlight that.
So do you think it's fair? What do you think it is that helps people to kind of navigate someone else's narrative?
Well, yeah, I think I think absolutely it's a fear. And I've had I think I'll go back to my policy background, that I've worked with individuals whose views politically are very different from my own and had to find some kind of common ground, right? And there is a lot of fear rooted in that. And I've written about some of my work. There's a major demographic shift that occurred over the last 20 years. And we know by 2042 or so, 2043, according to the US Census, the United States will become a majority minority country. And people around our society see that demographic shift occurring. And there are people who don't want that to occur.
Say that date again. Can you say that date one more time?
I think it's 2042 when the United States will become a majority minority.
The reason why I asked you, I stopped you there, is because I've heard this date move almost every year.
Yeah.
I've heard it move. I've heard it maybe back in 1990s into the early 2000s, where they were saying it was going to be like 2010 and 2015 and now it's 2042. In my own personal look at things and just take into account the political atmosphere right now around the voter suppression and the way that the elections have gone, Georgia turning blue, all these different things. I've had this in the back of my mind, and I wonder if, what you might say to this. I think that the browning of America has already occurred. And that's one of the reasons why folks have all this vested interest in keeping things status quo. That's my take. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an important point. Let me provide some context, because I think that's important. So we talk about 2042 majority minority nation, we're talking about above 50%, right? But what we have now is, I think, if you look at children under, I think this is the age of 7, they are from racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? So when we talk about, the browning of America, you're right, it's already occurred. Those individuals have already been born or continue to be born. But that group, when we get to 2042, will be adults. So those children are already, in our United States, once again, trying to enjoy their childhood. So we're talking about kids, I think it's 7 or under, are from majority racial and ethnic backgrounds. So it's important to provide some context.
Right. So yeah, I get that. I understand that whole context, but I'm looking at it in terms of, and maybe I'm going down the wrong pathway here, but I'm thinking about it in the context of, if we are already there in a real sense, then that taps into that fear that I think is coming from many communities that try to suppress and try to gerrymander and all those other things, the stuff that's going on in politics. Maybe not so much outside of politics, but in politics, there seems to be this fear that if we allow folks who have the right to vote, then we'll be out of office.
Yeah, it's about, and I think another thing is important, getting to your point, is that, when people have conversations with people, once again, kind of leaning on my experience and worked on policy issues on Capitol Hill and negotiating with the White House, et cetera, is that, this idea of, power and democracy are not necessarily the same thing, right? So you get to the idea, so you talk about the voter suppression laws, and some have noted here in the state of Florida and Georgia, and dozens of bills throughout the United States. Right. Do you believe in democracy, or do you try to maintain power? And I always try to tell people that there's a distinction between that. Yeah. Because if you're an American, you should believe in democracy, right? And you should believe in shared governance.
Right.
and that the people should be making the final decisions. And you shouldn't be preventing people from voting on like polls and polls and souls on Sunday, right? We saw, right? We've seen that in Texas and in various other places where they try to prevent, traditionally African Americans from going to polls before or after church. Also, in terms of various other ways in which we try to make sure how people vote. And obviously, we just, we're still in the pandemic, but there are a lot of other additional layers in terms of these voter suppression bills that are seeking a problem that doesn't exist.
Yes. So the thing is this, you just said that, souls to the polls, all those things that are really, a part of these narratives that are trying to block the vote, so to speak. Why is it important for people who are being blocked or oppressed to speak out and change the narrative? I know we can complain and we can boycott and we can do all those other things, but understanding what's happening, I've always thought this, and I'll backtrack a little bit and I'll just say, there was this talk about, well, these people don't have their license, or they don't have a voter ID that's comparable to going in and doing something. And I've always thought, well, why don't we get them their ID? What's the problem? If the problem is you don't want people to vote who are not registered or who don't have the right to vote, why are we stopping and blocking them? Because we know that everybody doesn't drive. We know that everybody doesn't have access to maybe a government ID or a student ID, and that there are people who may just need an ID to showcase who they are. How come we're not doing something as a country to make that happen, but we're willing to put a lot of money behind suppression?
Yeah, well, I think that's an age-old question for America in general, and I think you highlight some important points. So there have been a lot of nonprofit organizations throughout the nation who have been actively involved in getting individuals from underserved, marginalized populations, particularly Black and Brown, driver's licenses. But let's go back, and I told you I'm a student of history, so let's go back. Because ultimately what you have is with voter ID, requirements. It is just a barrier. And let me tell you what I mean by that, right?
Yeah.
So in this country, we've had grandfather clauses, literacy tests, right? So there, and even, when you see the, like, from movie, we look at the movie Selma that came out several years ago, and that opening scene with Oprah Winfrey, where she's been asked to articulate, this litany of information.
Right. Only to be denied.
Right. So
right.
I think that is symbolic of what voter ID laws are, right? And once again, this idea of voter law ID is not new. It's been around. The concept has certainly been around for a long time. And like I said, my perspective on this issue is a little bit different because I've sat in meetings when people have discussed various issues. Right. So I've said this issue's not been around for it's been around for a long time. But it's clear that people know that those individuals who are least likely to have ID are those who are from underserved, marginalized populations, the same people who are more likely to succumb to COVID-19, the same individuals who are more likely to be hurt from not accepting federal, unemployment insurance, and all these other things. We could just keep going down the list. Right. In a country that's supposed to be centered in democracy, we should be protecting and supporting those who need it the most.
So the perfect thing would be then, if you truly want people, or you say you want to be representative of the people, right? And so I'm thinking about it in terms of the suppression. The suppression is the people who you think won't vote your way or don't like your politics or your platform, so to speak. And so therefore, that's the connection I'm getting, right? Mm-hmm. And so the connection is that I'll stop you from voting because you possibly voting could mean I don't have a position any longer as a representative, as a congressperson, whatever, on the school board, however that is, right? And my way of thinking or my way of wanting the world to be won't be acknowledged because I'll get pushed out. And so I need to keep you at bay. I need to make sure you are not a part of this equation whatsoever, because if you are, then I'm going to be the one that's going to lose out. So therefore, I'm going to be the big man on campus and you're going to lose out before I lose out. And I'm going to do everything in my power to do that. Wouldn't it be easier to try to draw people to your cause than to push people away? And if that's the case, you've been in politics for a while, why are they not trying to, and I don't mean to try to appease people and try to, placate folks. What I'm talking about is why not try to draw people to your party or to your stance, as opposed to do things that's going to make them upset and rile them up. And then now there's this give and take, or this fighting back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And I think it goes back to the point I made, the difference between power and democracy, right? People, individuals, after the 2016 election, let me give you an example. You didn't see a waiver of voter suppression laws. After the last election, you did. It's not very difficult to connect the dots, right? You talked about Georgia, right? Yeah. So, Georgia sent, I think Senator Warnock was the first black male since before Reconstruction that was elected, besides Senator from South Carolina. But it doesn't happen. It's been essentially a once in a lifetime kind of an event. But when that happens, when you take a state that was solidly red historically and it's turned blue, that's shaking the foundation as it relates to power, right? So you have two African American male senators, now Senator Scott from South Carolina, and now Senator Warnock from Georgia. But that has changed the playing board. And now, so if you believe in democracy, then you applaud, because you saw the numbers of people that came out in Georgia and then their numbers went up. You applaud people like Stacey Abrams, et cetera, because they got people who historically don't vote. And then maybe people who are reluctant voters. That's also an important thing to remember, that went out and voted. So if you believe in democracy, you would applaud that and make it a lot easier. But if you were concerned about power, then we talk about gerrymandering and all these other challenges with suppression laws, et cetera, then you want to find a way to hold on to power. And those are the difference between power and democracy.
Right. So now I want to tie it together, right? So we got Juneteenth. We're celebrating that. And we're celebrating our emancipation, freedom. Tie that now to the voter suppression and why people who have this freedom should actually do more with it.
Yeah. And so thank you for that, the connection to our event today. And so it's important to note that, Juneteenth, we celebrate 1865 when General Granger enters Galveston, Texas, more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and letting those enslaved Africans know that they are now free, even though their freedom has really occurred more than 2 years ago. Yeah. So I think that the important connection is also to add is that it wasn't until later on to that year until the 13th Amendment was ratified, right? And so Blacks in this country were ultimately giving their freedom, right? And then your 13th, 14th, and 15th Reconstruction Amendments. So in order to make an important connection to today is that, several hundred years later, members of the Black community are still facing barriers when it comes to voting, when it comes to home ownership, when it comes to getting quality education, when it comes to healthcare, and when it comes to, being empowered to speak about issues that make people uncomfortable. And what I noted, I had a conversation with a colleague recently who has a different lived experience to me. And I noted for him is that, having a conversation about race may be uncomfortable. People don't look like me, but I'm burdened with that experience on a day-to-day basis, right? But if you believe in democracy, like I said, and not focus on power, then in democracy, you should be willing to have these conversations. And then we should have solutions to ensure that all Americans are given the opportunity to vote, and that we're not turning into some kind of dictatorship, which is inconsistent with democratic ideas.
Well, that's what one would think, right? That's what we've been told. That's been the principles. That's what's been in the documentation. But people sure seem to be kind of not following suit with that. I mean, we're patriots on certain times of the year, but we're not patriots at others. And so, what's your thoughts on patriotism? And should Black folks be patriots?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I believe it should be important to love the United States. It's a wonderful country. And I think that, it's important to be honest and understand that it's difficult, the duality of being Black in America, right? And Du Bois talked about, double consciousness, right? And souls of Black folk. So Black members of the Black community love America, right? Even though that, you know, and I had my grandfather fought in World War II, and I've had, you know, I know a member of people fought in Vietnam War and served in the military, and I have a family friend that serves in the military now. But the conflict is when they return home and they're denied opportunities, or in the past where, you know, even having black men in there and you wearing a uniform, and they've been lynched, right? So these are real documented events in terms of history. So members of the Black community love America. And my family goes back generations, like a lot of members in the Black community. So this is my country. But what is important to is I wanted to abide by the democratic ideas laid out in the Constitution. And then subsequently, all the laws have been passed since then, even the 1960s Voting Rights Act, et cetera, that Black people have fought for, because as Americans, we're being asked is people see our humanity.
Yeah, so you bring up a really interesting point. I immediately went to Colin Kaepernick and some other things about loving America. And so it always gets to be, it seems, that when there is some conflict, or maybe if there is a way that Black people are either boycotting or challenging the status quo, it's seen as being un-American, unpatriotic. But in a very real sense, it's very patriotic, because it's saying, look, I have a right to be here. I belong here. I need you to see me. My life matters, right? These are the things that they're asking for, which doesn't seem to be a hard give, right? It doesn't seem like it to be a hard give for you to respect me like I'm respecting you, right? And so, but it becomes, oh, you're kneeling and you're not respecting the flag, and so you are unpatriotic. And it's like, what? Hold on. That's not even the context of why he's kneeling. So how do we get away from people co-opting messages and really understand that, like you just said, Black folks do love America. Given all the stuff that has happened in our lives, we still see promise. We still see hope. We still see that there is a place for us to be able to have equal access and be able to provide for ourselves. But there's always something, a fence, a barrier that's in the way. And can you talk to that, or what comes up for you when I share some of that?
Yeah, so to kind of tie it into, you know, activism, as we talked about, and then Colin Kaepernick in particular, one of the things I want to note is that this country was founded because of activists, right? You know, as a revolution. So, you know, that's the
why we need to know our history.
Right,
why
exactly.
We need to know our history. Go ahead.
Exactly, right. So, you know, think about people, the Boston Tea Party, right? So how would those individuals been treated today? Right? How would that event been treated today? You can't, and like I said, once again, we don't, in my opinion, as an educator, we don't do a good job, because a lot of Americans aren't comfortable talking about issues that they don't want to talk about, right? So you can't say Colin Kaepernick is un-American, and then say those individuals in the Boston Tea Party who were angry, right? So let's be clear, they were angry and they dumped tea in the bay, right? So that's an act of activism. So when you say that, you know, Colin Kaepernick is not un-American, but you say it's, you learned about the Boston Tea Party in school, or when Dr. King's every year we honor him with his holiday, and you post quotes, or every American does that, you have to note that Dr. King was talking about systemic racism. Yeah. So you can't attack critical race theory and praise Dr. King on his holiday. Yeah. It's not those. It's inconsistent, and your conversation and your points are fragmented.
Yeah. So you bring up another point that now I need to get your perspective on something else. So I was reading up again this year on the Tulsa massacre, and one of the things I read out of the Washington Post was that this struck a chord. I mean, I've heard it before, I knew it, but what it was talking about in this article was that these folks were looting in Black communities. They were burning down communities, right? And stopping people from moving forward. Black Wall Street, all these different things that were going on, right? And then all of a sudden, they were right. They had every right to burn these people down, and then blame them for the city being burned down. Now let's kind of forward fast to 2021, or even the years up into 2021, 2020 to 2021, whatever. And there was conversations about Black people burning their own towns down and looting stores and all these other things, right? And if you think about history, again, talking about what knowledge base you have on history across the board, who looted? Who looted first? Who burned down people's cities first? We need to know our history. We need to understand and learn from our past so that we don't continue to do those different things. And now, is it okay for anybody to burn down anybody's city? I don't think so. That's my personal opinion. But we have to see it in context to all the things that are going on. So if you condemn it when it's happening in the Black community by Black and brown folks, then you also need to condemn it when you knew and through history, these have been the things that have been happening in Black and brown communities to keep them from moving forward. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so you just highlighted, the commemoration of 100 years of the Tulsa massacre, because that's what it was, right? Yeah. So let's tie it in, let's connect it historically from Florida, Roosevelt and Ocoee, right? Yeah, so these massacres occurred and have continued to occur throughout United States history, and there are many that are undocumented, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important distinction, right? Because those were massacres of men, women, and children who killed. You could talk about the Red Summer of 1919. And places like Washington, Chicago, yeah, and Arkansas, where these massacres occurred, and destroyed Black communities, right? So, and once again, this idea of having honest conversations about race. These are historical events. They occurred, and they occurred, and they devastated Black communities, right? And I know people want to talk about issues relating to demonstrations, and it's important to note when we talk about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that these killings of members of the Black community align with what we see in research in terms of, we know research-wise, and disproportionality of Black and brown people being killed by law enforcement. It's a fact. It occurs. Have
ability to say their names in a public platform.
Exactly, but I've known stories in my family's history, and I'm quite sure for others, of Black people who've been killed by individuals outside of their community for just being walking or driving their car.
Was burned down. My grandparents' home was burned down with their children in them. They all escaped, but that's part of our history. That's part of my history. It's part of why I am an advocate, because of those lessons that I'm learning from their story, their personal narratives.
And those events that happen far too often in American history. And I've written like this, and my work is centered in history, and in events. But the bottom line is a question. So I think, Dr. Bella, we've reached a moment, right, in this country, and then we have to ask ourselves, do we believe in democracy, right? And I believe in democracy, but I believe in holding people who are accountable, right? If you're an elected official or et cetera, you have access to funds or whoever you may be. Do you believe in democracy? Because democracy has to be nurtured. And if you don't nurture it, then the question is, what is next? Yeah. And this country can ill afford to travel down a path in which people's voting rights and their other rights are being denied.
Yeah, and I think that's really a good point, right? And I thank you for sharing that, because I think that those are the difficult conversations that have to happen, that we don't sit at a table and really hash out. We'll throw barbs at one another and do all these things that keep us at bay, but we don't know how to come together and really have this true, honest debriefing of what has been going on in America since the beginning of time.
Yeah, and it's funny, Dr. Bowler, we have this conversation about race. People see you and I, we're esteemed colleagues, and we've had a chance to, certainly as society is saying in terms of level of success, right? Yeah. But what I remind people all the time is that just having a degree or being a professor or whatever doesn't mean I can't be a victim of police brutality, misconduct, or someone can't stop me when I'm trying to vote and say they're challenging my ability to vote. These things happen every single day. Or I walk somewhere, I go in, I'm trying to buy a house or a car, and I'm trying a higher interest rate, or I'm denied a loan.
Wow. You're speaking my story, brother. Every day I go out of my house, I know I'm a Black man. Every single day. And I wonder what CTSD type of situation is going to come across, right? Continuous traumatic stress disorder,
right.
Every single day. And people don't understand that. They're like, you can live your best life. You got all this status. And I'm like, yeah, I have all this status, but today I thought about whether or not somebody wanted to kill me or not.
Yeah, that fear is real. And, even with family, I have a son.
Yeah.
And, my wife and I've written about this. And, my wife and I spent all this time building him up and telling him he's talented, he's wonderful. And then, but at some point we had to have the talk we all have in the Black community, particularly Black males, and warning him about interactions with law enforcement and other people who don't see his humanity.
Right.
And it is difficult, and it angers you because you poured all you can in your children and other family members, but you had to have this honest conversation about what it means to be Black in America.
Can you talk about the significance of that talk? Because I don't know that people really get it. People are like, you had to talk. What's the talk? What's the
Yeah,
talk?
sure. I love to unpack that. And I think I had a chance maybe last year to write something for UCF when I talk about that. But, and I think I wrote an op-ed about that for, ebony.com or jet.com 2-3 years ago. But yeah, so the talk in the Black community is when it's time when you look at your children and you realize that society may not see them as kids anymore, right? They've gotten a little bit taller, and that initial fear hits you. And then you realize you have to sit down with, whether it's your child or, someone you have guardianship over, or a nephew or niece, et cetera. And then you have to tell them about kind of be careful what happens if they get pulled over, right? Because we have these honest conversations, how you should respond, not move your hands, right? Your tone of voice. And for people who are watching this, these are real. This is a conversation I've had with my son multiple times, right? And these are real, right? So that talk is that initial conversation about you realizing that society view them differently now. And then it's a warning, essentially, to let them know that you have to be careful. And for people who are watching this who may not be aware of this, the talk is real and occurs. It has happened for generations.
So, you bring that up, and, I have a young daughter and I have a stepson. And those same situations come up for me as well. And people just don't connect there. They're like, well, I have concerns for my children too. And I'm like, but do you have the same? Do you understand? Can you walk in the shoes of a person who knows that if their child gets put over by a police officer, that they're already suspicious of that person and that they can lose their life because of that? Because it's documented, right? There's historical facts of people coming into positions with law enforcement, and it's not everybody. And I don't, this is not a crucifixion of law enforcement, because again, like you said, you have people in the military. I have people in my family who are in law enforcement. I have good friends who have been a part of the law enforcement society, and so it's not about that. We understand that there are people who do bad things, but it's also understanding that there's a racial reckoning or something that's coming out of people when they hold those positions, when they think that they have power over another individual. If you think a person did something so badly that they need to be arrested for, well, arrest them and let the law play out, law and order, right? But that's not how things typically happen. Right? You have these people who become the executioner in the moment, right? And then saying, oh, I was fearful for my life. Well, what did you create in that situation to make it so that people would make you fearful? Because are you complicit in your fear, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and that fear gets into how society reinforces stereotypes and misconceptions about Black and brown communities, right? And like I said, as you well aware, I'm willing to confront these issues because I have to, because I realize that this is my life. I have family and friends, a son that I love very deeply, and I care about democracy, right? And so I think another point I want to make is, you mentioned law enforcement. Is I have 2 frat brothers I've known for a number of years who are both police officers, and I love dearly. But we've had these conversations because they're also Black men, right? So they're acutely aware. It's also, when we talk about, I know we've talked about statistics, but there's a study from 2022, researchers from Harvard that found, when it comes to law enforcement, that based on the data was collected over a 7-year period, that members of the Black community were more than 3 times likely to be killed by law enforcement. That's quantitative data, But it's not the only study out there that shows that, right?
Right.
Data from the Department of Justice and and state data, particularly people file lawsuits. This is not new, right? These ideas, concepts about these challenges as relates to relationship between law enforcement and Black community, once again, have been going on for generations. So the question is, what are you prepared to do about it? So if elected officials ignoring it, saying it's not an issue, then what you're saying is you don't see my humanity.
Right. So a colleague of mine posted on social media that one of their students said, this was a white female student, I believe, said something to the effect of, and I'll give a shout out to Dr. Rochelle Joe there, said that the person said in a paper to her or in a discussion post that if Black kids can experience racism in the second grade, then white students can learn about it.
That's a good point. I'm going to even take it a little further back than that. It's a point I made earlier before when it comes to, Black people experiencing it early on. It goes back even before that, right? We talked about infant mortality rates, right? So this issue about the burden of being Black in America starts before you were even born, right? The high rate in which Black women in terms of die from pregnancy-related deaths compared to white women, that's quantitative data, right? We know that. It equates to many people in the countries that, we are much smaller in the United States with fewer resources. And so it is a systemic problem in issues like this, healthcare, et cetera. So we need to have that conversation because, I love being Black. I wouldn't change it for anything else in the world. But what I am asking people to do is I'm abide by democratic principles set forth in the Constitution and, amended throughout history, through our country's history. And the individuals who don't do that, then you need to be held accountable. And that's just my position.
It's a wonderful position to have. So we're coming up on the end of this hour, and I want to give you some time to talk a little bit about your program and any last minute things you want to share about what you're hoping to have people learn about Juneteenth and just the significance of this program for the Orlando community.
Yeah, certainly. I would certainly recommend people go and buy books or Google, and there's been articles on Juneteenth and what it means. And I guess it's been celebrated since, goes back to 1865, right? In General Granger entering Galveston, Texas. But it's important to know these celebrations occur throughout the United States, everywhere, right? And in cities and jurisdictions everywhere. But our event that we're having later on today, once again, is a trio of brilliant Black women. And I'm hoping that people listen carefully to this discussion that starts at 11 o'clock today. We'll go for noon. In terms of not only in terms of some of the challenges these wonderful, it is brilliant Black women have encountered, but also some of their advice and hopes for the future. So I think that it's really important, not just for members of the Black community, but anybody who's interested in the challenges and the success of Americans in general. Should certainly check out our live interview. Once again, I'm feel very fortunate to moderate discussion with this talented trio and look forward to the interaction.
So how can they get the link to it, or where can they get the information about joining in on the live?
There's a flyer. I know that I think if you it's going to be live via, and I think we might be even using your link on YouTube. I believe it'll be live on YouTube. Okay. So they can certainly, I think if they even go to your ODI, you guys have a YouTube site. I think that they'll be able to watch.
There you go. Yes, ODI.
They'll be able to watch it live through that link.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm looking forward to what you're going to be bringing to the table there. You do have some heavyweights that will bring the noise. I love that saying. Ever since I saw there was a Broadway play about bring the funk, bring the noise.
Yeah, sure. The tap dancers, I remember.
Yes. So I know they're going to bring the noise, so to speak, in terms of helping people understand the significance of the day. You're doing phenomenal work.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you taking time out and being a part of today's podcast. You dropped some serious knowledge today. I hope that people will really pay attention to it. And you named a couple of different things. And I think that one of the things I would hope to attach to this, because this will be available on YouTube as well, that we'll have some links in there about how they can get information, more information about Juneteenth, more information about all the things that we talked about today, whether it be the Tulsa Massacre and other things. I think that that is something that will help people kind of open their minds to some of the things that have been going on. And I think, for me, this is not about retribution. It's not about really trying to hurt anyone. It's really about trying to open the door up for people to have equal access and a place at the table. And I think that when I hear people having fear about, what a Black and brown person may do, or what their motivation is and how it might hurt or harm them, as much as I can say at the top of my lungs, I don't want your stuff. I don't think anybody wants your stuff. I think they want equal access to be able to get their own stuff.
Right.
But because they are being denied, you see it as people wanting your stuff.
Right.
And we have to kind of change that narrative.
I agree. It's about, and like I said, I'll go back to my point about it's about democracy, not about power. It's about democracy.
Yeah. Great. Excellent. Any last minute words?
No, I just want to thank you for taking time, out of your busy schedule to invite me. I know this is, I've had a chance to watch a few of your discussions, so I feel very fortunate to be on, and we're welcome in the future.
Well, hopefully we'll have you back again, because you're doing great things, and I'm excited for your journey. I'm excited for UCF that you're here. It's important. I think the Orlando community needs to be able to hear your voice. And I've watched a couple of the things that you've been on, and I've seen your op-eds. And so it's important. It's important. It's just, there's nothing more than just people understanding that you just need to listen and hear and do your own research and understand that if you're talking about fairness and equity for all, then what we're going to do is make sure that there is fairness and equity for all. And so thank you. And
thank you.
I want to thank you all for tuning in today, and hopefully you'll be looking and hearing us next time around. So we're checking out. Matters of Diversity with Dr. B is tapping out for today. So thank you for your time.